If you've ever been to Virginia, you've probably heard of my family. My name is Vincent Lockwell, and I am the president and owner of Lockwell Industries. My family and I own two food processing plants in Virginia, as well as a chain of electronics stores in every state on the East Coast. But my proudest achievement is the Lockwell Law Firm, which I built with my two sons and daughter. Oh yes, I forgot to mention that I am also responsible for the introduction and production of some prestigious and, of course, very expensive brands of wine. I always tend to forget this part of my empire, but for good reason. You see, I'm a lawyer, or should I say I was a lawyer when I was younger. I am now 88 years old, and at this very moment, while I am explaining to you what is going on in my head, I am in the hospital on my deathbed. Yes, a year ago doctors discovered I had liver cancer. Yesterday I was told that in a few hours I will meet my creator. All my children came to see me this morning. I saw a lot of tears in their eyes, and I know that they all love me very much. Now I am supposed to rest, but my thoughts take me to all the important events of my life before the last journey. I have nothing to complain about in life, well, almost nothing. With the exception of a few bad decisions I've made and a few bad actions that I'm ashamed of, and for which I ask God to forgive me, I truly believe that I've lived a good life. I also know that I will leave a mark on this world. But the greatest achievement in my life, the one I am most proud of, was raising my children in the path of righteousness and justice and instilling in them respect for others. You see, my wife and I raised a family of 6 children, 3 boys and 3 girls. Each of them is now married or married, and each has their own children. But what's special about my children isn't that my wife and I raised them to be kind and caring people. No, back in the days when we started having a family, young couples were expected to have many children and for their parents to guide them on the right path in life. No, the most special thing for me is that when I was a young teenager, this was in the early 40s, I became seriously ill. I had a very high fever for 2 days and 2 nights. I recovered after a week or so, but later learned as I got older that the fever had affected my ability to have children. When, after several years of marriage, I took tests and found out that my wife was still not pregnant, the doctor told me that I had zero chance of becoming a father. I was born in 1922 in a small town on the east coast of the United States. My father left my mother just a few years after I was born, and when I was 5, my mother died of a terrible illness. I don't even remember my mother's face and have never seen a photograph of her in those days. It was not very common to take photographs. But later my grandmother, with whom I went to live, told me that my mother was very beautiful and loved me very much. After my mother died, I went to live with my grandmother in a big house on the outskirts of a small town called Rockridge. In those days, life was simple and difficult. Half of the children my age did not go to school at all, and the other half either had rich parents or worked at home while studying. But although I was not born into a rich family, I was still one of the lucky ones because my grandmother insisted that I complete high school after completing primary school. So for the next 4 years, I was among the privileged who attended Rock Ridge High School. Even though it wasn't common in those days to graduate from high school, it still wasn't enough for my grandmother. She then insisted that I go to college as soon as I graduated from high school. By that time, World War II had just ended and the world economy was beginning to pick up speed again. Of course, money was still tight, and given the fact that I had to rent a place in a big city to continue my studies, this caused difficulties for both me and my grandmother. Soon my grandmother had to sell part of the farm to pay my expenses. 6 months before I graduated from law school, my only living relative, my grandmother, died in her bed. It was 1944, I was 22 years old. That same year, I graduated and became a lawyer. Immediately after graduation, I sold my grandmother's house, as well as the remaining land around the house, and with the money from the sale, I bought a car and a small house in Deadline Ridge. Until then, I didn't have the time or money to meet girls often. My experience with the opposite sex was limited to only a few dates. A few months after starting work, I met my future wife. I was hired to work for a small law firm in Deadline Ridge, and I was making very good money. On weekends, I used to get in the car and drive around the area, enjoying the scenery. I was still a country boy at heart and didn't like city life. On one of these trips, I was driving through the countryside about 30 miles from home. I was driving along a poorly maintained road and admiring the trees on both sides of the road when I heard a strange knocking noise coming from my car's engine. I haven't seen a single car in the last 20 minutes, and until I heard this strange noise from the engine, I felt very good about admiring nature. Then, a few seconds after I heard the noise, the engine died. The car had enough momentum that I could safely park it on the side of the road. Of course, I opened the hood and looked inside. But since I didn't know much about cars, I realized I needed help. The nearest building I could see was the spire of a small church about 2 miles ahead and slightly to the right. I realized it was on a side road, so I started walking across the fields straight towards the church. When I got there half an hour later, I saw a neat little house located a couple 100 feet from the church. I immediately went up to the house and knocked on the door. As soon as the door opened, I experienced something I had never felt before in my life. The young woman standing in front of me seemed to have a strange power over me. I just stood in front of her silently and could not look away. She was about 20 years old and of average height. She definitely wasn't a beauty queen, but she wasn't ugly either. There was something about her that made me want to keep looking at her. Although I didn't realize it at the time, I fell in love with her from the first time I met her. Her name was Mary Beth Goldman. She was the only daughter of a minister and lived with her mother and father in a house next to the church. I learned a couple of weeks later that although she was 20 years old, she had never traveled more than 50 miles from home. I also soon realized, after I got to know her better, that she was incredibly naive for a girl her age. Mary Beth, or Beth as I preferred to call her, had a strange effect on me from day one. I felt a strong attraction to her, the reason for which I could not explain to myself. Therefore, when I first saw her on the day when she opened the door for me, I realized that I had met my destiny. She was the one I had been waiting for all my life, and I knew I needed to get to know her better. She had shoulder-length brown hair and was tall about 5 feet 7 inches with strong hips and a very thin waist. Her big brown eyes seemed to reach out to me, and I couldn't take my eyes off her face. That day, as she stood in front of me in the doorway of her home, she was wearing a long-sleeved, knee-length plaid jumper with a white blouse underneath. Despite this, I could tell that under all the layers of clothing covering her, she had a very full and attractive bust. Soon I started dating Beth. Her father didn't approve of me at first, but her mother did, and since Beth was already 20 and old enough to make her own choices, I gradually got to know her better as we dated. Less than 9 months after we met, we were married and she moved into my house. By this time, Beth was eager to have children, and since I was now successful as a lawyer, we bought a much larger house in Rock Ridge Height, a house with more land around it. The house, like the entire street, was located on a high and long ridge in the southern part of the city. From here, we had a wonderful view of the city itself below us, as well as the wide river several miles away. It was a very large house, built 50 years ago, but was still in very good condition. Apart from a new roof and paint, it needed very little repair. We had neighbors on either side of us, but since most of the houses on this street were built on large lots, our neighbors were at least 100 yards away on each side. In front of us, on the other side of the street, there were no houses, since the rock ridge on this side of the street was not wide enough to build houses there. Behind the house, there was a forest that led to a small road behind our street. This way, we had all the privacy we needed and were still fairly close to the city below us. To the left of our house lived a married couple who had no children. It was the Erikssons. Sven Eriksson was a Swedish man, 30 years old, who had been married to his American wife Alexandra for a couple of years. Alexandra was about the same age as Beth, but unlike my wife, she had long dark hair and was shorter than Beth. She was very beautiful and laughed all the time. Once we moved into our new home, both women became very good friends. Sven and I didn't become friends as women. In fact, I found him self-centered and very arrogant. Therefore, although our wives were good friends and visited each other constantly, I had to force myself to be nice to Sven. I suppose he valued my company no more than I did, and we only spoke to each other on those special occasions when the four of us dined together in the courtyard. I soon learned that Sven's family moved to America when he was still a young man. His father was involved in winemaking. Sven was now the owner of his father's business and had a dozen full-time employees working for him downtown. He even had 4 or 5 brands of wine that were sold in half the states in the country. In his large cellar with a constant and ideal temperature, he constantly experimented with the creation of new varieties of wine. It is worth mentioning here that deep below some of the houses on the ridge, where our houses were located, were many natural caves connected to man-made tunnels deep in the rock. They were used a century ago to store prohibited goods. Because the main tunnels opened onto the river, this system was also used during Prohibition to hide and transport illegal alcoholic beverages along the river. Sven's parents immigrated to America from Sweden, and both are now deceased. As for Sven, he was a typical Viking in appearance. He was tall and muscular. He wore his blonde hair quite long, although this was not fashionable at that time. He also had clear blue eyes, and even his voice was deep and powerful. Yes, he definitely had that wild look that comes to people's minds when they hear the word Viking. But I didn't like him at all. He had this one self-centered demeanor, and on more than one occasion, I saw him look at my wife in a way that left no room for imagination. I mentioned this to Beth several times, but it seemed to amuse her, and she just laughed, asking me if I was jealous of Sven. We had been living in our new house for a year and Beth was still not pregnant. So one day she suggested that we both go to our family doctor to check if we had any problems. We had separate appointments, and when I returned home the following Monday, she immediately threw her arms around me, telling me that she was doing well to conceive children. Now she was wondering what the doctor would tell me since my appointment was scheduled for Friday of that same week. So, after answering many questions, the doctor took from me tests and examined them under a microscope. Then I was shocked to learn that I had no chance of becoming a father, zero. In other words, if I ever had the chance to become a father, it would be a miracle. It was devastating. I couldn't even imagine how Beth would react to this news. After all, she really wanted us to start having children. I knew then that adoption was our only option. However, I decided to lie to my wife a little. I knew that sooner or later she would have to find out the truth, but I wanted to wait a little before telling her the bad news. So when I got home that day, I told her that I was fine and we shouldn't have any problems conceiving a child. So life went on. One day, a couple of months after visiting the doctor, I noticed the first signs that something was wrong. Firstly, the dinners she prepared for me every day when I returned home were not as fancy as they used to be. Now we began to eat much simpler cold meat dishes and salads. Then I noticed that the house was no longer as perfect as before. Of course, the house was still clean, but little things like the bed being neatly made as it always had been before, and the laundry not always being done on time like before. Even the dishes often remained in the sink for half a day. Another change I noticed was the way she started dressing at home. I couldn't explain these changes. Of course, I didn't make a big deal out of it. Then a couple of weeks later, I got a terrible shock. As soon as I returned home from work one day, she told me terrible news. She was pregnant. She, of course, expected that I would be overwhelmed with joy as soon as I found out about it. She was extremely excited and smiling when she told me this, even hugging me and kissing me, expecting me to share her joy. "Are you happy, Vincent? Finally, we will become a real family. You will become a father, and I will soon become a mother." This is a wonderful surprise, Beth. I almost lost hope in our ability to have children. I know this is very important to you, and of course, I'm very happy. Deep down, I still didn't know what to think. There were only two possibilities for her being pregnant. Either the test they gave me was wrong, or my wife was cheating on me. From that day on, Beth lived in her own world. She immediately began planning to renovate one of the rooms for the coming baby. She also started buying clothes for herself and the baby. The first question I asked myself then was, with whom could she cheat? I spent many sleepless nights trying to figure this out and always came up with the same answer. She must have cheated on me with our neighbor Sven. The thing is that she was at home all the time, and since she did not yet have a car for travel, she could not go far from home. In addition, I knew that Sven's wife, Alexandra, often went to visit her disabled mother, who lived in Maple Hill, about 90 miles away. Every 2 weeks she went to her mother for a couple of days by train. I have already noticed that on the days when his wife was away, Sven stayed at home to do his winemaking in the cellar. It was too much of a coincidence. I thought that he and my wife must also have been experimenting together. But even though she was carrying Sven's baby, she was still so sweet to me, constantly trying to get me onto the couch or into our bedroom so I could make love to her. If it was possible, she was even more ready and eager to have sex with me all the time. Whatever I wanted to do with her, she agreed and participated in it with great pleasure. However, I knew I had a big decision to make. I needed to decide what to do. Should I get rid of her immediately or just pretend nothing happened and continue making love to her for a while longer? After all, I had no reason to complain about the amazing sex we had. Plus, she took care of the house and me, and when she put her heart into it, her cooking was fantastic. So I decided not to rush things and see what happens next. Besides, if I had to leave her, I would need solid evidence of her cheating. There were no DNA tests in those days, so I needed to find hard evidence of their connection. Something like photographs or witnesses of her actual infidelity with Sven, or the fact that I was infertile, which had to be proven 100%. 2 weeks later, I went to Richmond under the pretext that I had business there, and the doctor checked my tests again. As expected, I was told that I was completely unfit to become a father, and the doctor even added that there was no hope of changing this. This only confirmed what I already knew. Beth cheated on me in a twisted way. She had allowed another man to father her child, and now planned for me to raise that child as my own. Now that I was succeeding in law, I was also in the process of purchasing the law firm in which I was a partner. This left me with very little time to think about or follow up on her cheating. Several months passed, and I still couldn't catch her in the act of being with Sven. I was devastated by what she did to me, but at the same time my irritation subsided a little. Every time I returned home from work, Beth would ask me to run my hand over her belly to see if it was any larger than the previous day. But what she didn't understand was that every time I looked at her pregnant figure, I felt a lot of emotions. At first, I felt anger building inside me. Here, my loving wife stands in front of me, asking me to feel her pregnant belly, in which someone else's child is growing, while she pretends that it is mine. Every time she did this, I couldn't help but imagine her and Sven laughing at me together and making jokes about me. Then a lot of questions popped up in my head. Where did they have sex? How often did they do this each week? When I thought about this, I felt a whirlwind of emotions, ranging from rage to self-pity, moving through curiosity and love. Yes, I still loved her. I soon received the answer to the last question when I returned home from the office one afternoon to get the necessary documents. Last year, I had a contractor build an addition to our home over a large garage. I needed space for a home office and built it over our home's double garage, connecting it to the house. My home office had a door leading to a second-floor hallway and also an entrance with stairs inside the garage itself. That day, I parked my car in the garage as usual. But since I was planning to leave as soon as I got the necessary documents, I entered my home office through the stairs in the garage. Documents in hand, I was about to leave the same way I came when I heard strange sounds from behind the door leading into the corridor of the house. Then it dawned on me. I already knew that Alexandra went to see her disabled mother yesterday. Placing the documents that were still in my hands on the table, I quietly opened the door to the corridor and entered. As soon as I was a few feet from the first open bedroom, I knew they were there. I was beyond shocked, although I knew that she was cheating on me. My instinct told me to rush into the room and separate them. For a few minutes, I felt like killing them both, but then I realized that such an act would definitely ruin my life. Instead, I quietly returned to my home office and sat at my desk, thinking about what I had just seen. I knew I had an important decision to make. Should I go into the room and stop them? Or should I just leave the house and pretend nothing happened? I saw more than enough and quietly left the house. When I got home from work that day, Beth was even nicer to me than usual. After handing me my slippers, she gave me my usual glass of wine and tried to snuggle up to me as I sat on the couch. But I couldn't let that happen because I still had images in my head of her recent betrayal that made me a cuckold. I was still not sure how I would react when we went to bed for the night. Over the next few days, I still felt depressed. I didn't know what to do. Should I kick her out and create a scandal, or should I just pretend I don't know anything about her affair? It is worth noting that in those days, it was very unusual for a man to leave his wife. Man divorcing with his wife did not have a good reputation, as this was considered a failure for both parties in the marriage. I knew my business would also suffer greatly if I got rid of Beth. On the other hand, I had a hard time convincing myself that Beth still loved me. Of course, she was always ready and even eager to have sex with me. She took care of me and was a very good housewife. But did she love me now that she had sex with Sven? She may have loved, but at the same time I knew that I was not the only man in her life and in her heart. Now I was a cuckold, and perhaps she respected me less than before, even if she thought I knew nothing about her affair. But nothing could be changed about what she did. Either I accepted it and lived with it, or I got rid of her. Like water flowing down a slope, I chose the path of least resistance and did nothing about her connection with Sven. I just pretended that I knew absolutely nothing about her cheating. Gradually, she began to show more signs of her pregnancy. At every opportunity, she still showed me her rounded belly and asked me to stroke it. Deep down, I felt that it gave her pleasure to constantly remind me of her condition. Perhaps she enjoyed the fact that I was not the father of her child, and knowing that I was completely unaware of the real paternity of her child was exciting for her. Every time I watched her move around the house, although I knew that she did not notice that I was looking at her, in me flared up a wave of anger, and I again saw in my imagination those pictures of her cheating with Sven. And so it went. Beth carried her pregnancy to completion and gave birth to a beautiful baby boy whom we named Tom. I could see how proud and happy she was after Tom was born. She took good care of him, and it didn't take long for our sex life to recover shortly after her son was born. A few months after Tom was born, I still wasn't sure if she was continuing her relationship with Sven. But one day, just 3 months after Tom was born, she told me she was pregnant again. So I realized that she and Sven were still together. Strange, but what surprised me most was my complete indifference to her new pregnancy. It was as if she told me she bought a new hat. First of all, I loved Tom very much, and by that time I already considered him my own son. I said to myself, why should I feel bad about her having sex with Sven? After all, she was still the loving wife I married, and she was always ready and eager to satisfy my every sexual need. In addition, she gave me a son that I would not have been able to have otherwise, and no one except her and Sven knew about the true paternity of my son. So I just kept silent about her affair, and life went on as usual. By the time she gave birth to a daughter, whom we named Anna after my mother, I had completely come to terms with the fact that I was not the biological father of my children and that my wife was cheating on me on a regular basis. However, I have to say one thing here. If I knew that people knew that I knew that Page cheating on me, that would be a completely different matter. I would never allow people to look at me with sadness or a smirk on their face because they knew something about me that they thought I knew nothing about. In other words, I certainly didn't want anyone to find out that my wife was cuckolding my neighbor. For some reason that I can't even begin to explain, Beth's connection with Sven no longer affected me the way it should have. After all, I was still getting all the sex I could get from my wife and could tell that she really cared about me, and yes, I knew that she still loved me. Besides, by that time I was used to her infidelities, and the fact that the fruits of her infidelity were the birth of my children, whom I loved so much, mitigated the fact that I was a cuckold. Yes, she gave me children that I could never have had on my own. I loved my children like a caring father, even though she was at the beginning of her third pregnancy. I was even looking forward to holding my next baby. I know some people might think I'm a coward and a loser, but believe me, I'm not one of those people. I simply made the best of my shortcomings. Yes, I couldn't have children. That was a fact I had to live with and come to terms with. I was painfully aware of it. Since it was impossible for me to be the biological father, I realized that I needed to make the best of my situation and thus accept her betrayal as the price to pay for being able to have my own children. Yes, they were my children. Thanks to my wife's infidelity and her pregnancy as a result, I had the opportunity to show the rest of the world that I was a normal married man with a family and children of my own. No one except her and Sven knew that I was not the biological father of my children. More important to me was that she thought that I was completely unaware of this. I hoped that this secret would always remain so, since I would have to act decisively if anyone found out the real paternity of my children. I now accepted what she did to me, even though I didn't approve of it. She still had sex with Sven regularly, and it no longer bothered me like it did at the beginning of their relationship. Because they thought that their betrayal had remained a secret, I could still look them in the eyes without hesitation. Yes, each of us received something from their connection. I got the family while Beth got all the sex she needed, and what's more, she was now a mother. Events unfolded and time passed until I gradually became the father of 6 children, 3 boys and 3 girls. My wife continued her relationship with Sven for over 10 years. By the time Beth gave birth to her 6th child, I was 36 and she was 34. When Alexandra's mother died last year, Sven no longer had a reason to leave his husband for a couple of days every 2 weeks. Although Beth and Sven stopped having sex in our house after Beth had her 3rd child, that didn't stop them from continuing their encounters. In fact, I knew that they were meeting more often now. We now had a nanny to help Beth with the kids and a housekeeper to clean and cook. Being the resourceful man that he was, and unknown to his wife, Sven rented an apartment in the city so that Beth could meet him there twice a week, mostly during the day while I was at the office. Of course, by that time she already had her own car, and it was relatively easy for her to get to her lover during the day while the nanny was at home looking after the children who were not yet in school. Alexandra and Sven still didn't have children of their own because of the problem she had, and since she didn't drive, Sven felt safe cheating with Beth in the apartment. The birth of Beth's 6th child was long and painful. The doctor later told us that it would be very dangerous for her to have another child. Of course, by that time I believed that our family was already large enough, and I agreed with the doctor to stop there. I told him that we would be careful not to let her become pregnant again until she was healthy enough for surgery to prevent further pregnancies. But after discussing this issue at home, I realized that Beth had no intention of stopping having children. She insisted she felt fine and knew her body was still healthy and capable of carrying at least one more child. I knew that Sven, being the selfish jerk that he is, wouldn't care about Beth's safety. I needed to do something quickly to stop this. The only way I could see to stop them was to let them know that I knew about their affair, thus making them stop having sex. But by doing this, I would have to admit to them, and perhaps to everyone, that I am not the biological father of my children. This would mean admitting that all these years I knew that they were cuckolding me. This was not an acceptable option for me, and yet I saw no other way out of this situation. The more I thought about this whole situation, the less I could think of a way to get out of it. Admitting that I knew from the beginning about my wife's affair with Sven, and worse, letting my wife know that I already knew that I was not the biological father of my children, was devastating for me. The first week after Beth returned from the hospital after giving birth to her daughter, I couldn't sleep more than 2 or 3 hours a night. Of course, she hadn't started having sex with Sven yet, but it was only a matter of time. It was clear that she had no intention of waiting the full 40 days the doctor recommended before having sex with Sven. So knowing this danger forced me to take action. I told myself that since I had to choose between Beth and Sven, I would choose Beth since she was my wife, at least in name, and besides, I had children to think about. So that day I decided that Sven should leave. On the day I bought my house, almost 12 years ago, I was shocked to discover that the basement of the house was part of a tunnel that also ran under several other houses on the street. The tunnel led towards a river several miles away, and the ridge on which the houses were built contained a network of caves connected by this man-made tunnel. Of course, the first thing I did after buying the house was make sure both ends of the tunnel were closed. On one side, it went about 50 feet where the ceiling collapsed and completely blocked it off, so there was no problem on that side. But on the other side, the side leading to Sven's house, it continued for more than 200 feet to a thick oak door that was still in good condition. There was also a small pile of rocks that had fallen from the ceiling in front of the door, preventing it from opening. I knew there was no need to be afraid that someone could enter my house through the tunnel. The tunnel was located quite deep under the house, and two stairs led to it. The first, wooden one, led to the basement of the house. From there, a second set of steps cut into the rock descended another 20 feet or so, giving access to the tunnel itself. I had never tried to open a thick oak door before. Firstly, it was locked with a huge lock, and then, even if it were possible to open it after all these years, the pile of stones blocking it was enough to scare away anyone who tried to do so. But now, since I needed a way to get into Sven's cellar without being seen, I wondered if the passage on the other side of the door led to his wine cellar. After I cut the old lock with a saw, and then struggled to open the thick door a few inches with a metal rod, I felt a draft. Then, after many hours of work stacking stones on either side of the wall, I was ready to enter the other side. Holding the flashlight in my hand, I was able to squeeze through the open part of the door. As expected, after walking less than 100 yards, I found myself behind a tall counter loaded with bottles of wine. I knew I was in Sven's wine cellar. With difficulty waking up between the counter and the wall, I found myself in the middle of his wine cellar. Of course, I had already been here several times with him, and I was familiar with the location. There were thousands of bottles of a variety of wine, carefully placed on racks, and at the far end of the cellar were several dozen wooden barrels of wine that were ripening. Now I knew that I had a way to get into his cellar without being noticed, and before going back, I took with me a bottle of his best wine. My plan was simple. I knew that he already had batches of experimental wine that would soon be moved to the lower part of the cellar for secondary fermentation, since the temperature there was more suitable for slow fermentation. I came up with a plan to get rid of Sven. I knew that his wife Alexandra never went down to the lower basement of their house. She was afraid to go there. I stayed home for the next 2 days, working in my home office and mostly watching Sven's house. As soon as he arrived home, I went into the tunnel and waited. On the second day, I saw him arrive home at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and I knew that he was going to check his wine before dinner. He always did this when he came home early. I was standing with my ear pressed to the closed tunnel door when I quietly heard the sound of glass breaking from the other side. Only at the beginning of the evening, a hysterical and crying Alexandra came running to our house. It took several minutes before my wife and I were able to get her to say that she had found her husband on the floor in the lower basement. I immediately went to check the stairs from above and called the police. Hours later, his body was removed and his death was declared an accident. Alexandra, and especially my wife, were devastated by Sven's death. But deep down, I felt relieved. After all, he made a fool of me all these years and fathered all my 6 children, thinking I didn't know anything about it. All this time, he must have been secretly laughing at me for raising his children. No, I didn't regret that he died at all. He had sex with my wife behind my back for years. I even heard him say nasty things about me when he was with my wife. Besides, it was a choice I had to make. It was either his life or Beth's life. Besides, it was only fair that he paid with his life for what he did to me. Far from regretting that I was responsible for his death, I felt some relief now that he was no longer around. Of course, Beth didn't get pregnant again, but she was in shock and sad for a very long time after Sven's death. I knew that she really missed her lover, but less than a year after his death, she had diagnosed with a disease, and 6 months after diagnosis, she died. My youngest child was not yet 3 years old at this time, and my eldest son, Tom, had turned 14 the previous month. I had 6 children at home with me, and everyone truly believed they were mine since I was the only one alive who knew the truth about my children's real father. Now it felt like a huge weight had been lifted from my shoulders, as I was no longer afraid that the truth would suddenly become known to everyone. Out of pity for my family and me, or because she was lonely at home without her husband, Alexandra began to visit us more often. I didn't care for what reason, but her presence and help to the children and me in the evenings was a blessing to the whole family. Gradually, she began to spend more and more time with us, and after a couple of months, she came to our house only to spend the night. Of course, the nanny and housekeeper were still there to help, but Alexandra slowly began to take Beth's place in the children's eyes. Then one Saturday evening, after leaving the children in the care of a nanny, I invited her to a restaurant in the city, and afterward we went dancing. She was nothing like Beth. Alexandra was gentle and affectionate. Within a few months, we both realized we were in love with each other, and less than a year after my wife died, I proposed to her. We had a wonderful life together. She was the perfect wife for me, and by the time the last of my children left home and went to university, Alexandra and I were still very much in love and very rich. My 2 children now worked with me at the law firm, and Alexandra's winery in town, which she had inherited from her cheating husband, was also making a lot of money, now employing over 50 people. Now this brings me back to the present. Alexandra died in her sleep last year. She was 85 years old, and I know she had a very happy life with me. Now mine has arrived turn to join to her, and that is why I am now so eager to leave this world. I had a good life despite the fact that my children are not mine, but when I die, no one will ever know, and my secret will be lost forever, as it should be. Everyone here knows about the family Laquelle from Virginia, and I know I have definitely left my mark on this world. Subscribe to our channel so that your second chaff doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think about listening to the next one. Out listening to the next one. Out listening